Everyone told Sophia Bennett she was missing something: money, connections, experience, a detailed business plan. According to almost everyone around her, those were the ingredients you needed to build a successful company. Without them, people said, you weren't starting a business. You were setting yourself up to fail. Sophia had none of them: no wealthy family, no influential network, no experienced mentors, no investors waiting to write checks, not even a polished business plan, just an ordinary notebook filled with handwritten observations. Pages of customer complaints, ideas scribbled in the margins, questions nobody else seemed interested in asking, and one problem she simply couldn't stop thinking about. Most people would have waited until they had more savings, more confidence, more experience, a better plan, a safer moment. Sophia didn't. One evening, sitting alone at her small kitchen table, she opened that notebook and realized something. She could spend years preparing, or she could start learning by doing. That night, she made a decision that would change the rest of her life. She started anyway. People called it reckless. Some called it naive. Others simply smiled politely and assumed the business would quietly disappear within a year. After all, how could someone with no money, no powerful connections, and no real roadmap possibly compete against companies that had been dominating the market for decades? From the outside, the answer seemed obvious. She couldn't. But what nobody realized was that while everyone else had resources, Sophia had something much harder to find: a deep understanding of the problem. She had spent years listening when everyone else was talking, watching when everyone else was assuming, learning while everyone else believed they already had the answers, and sometimes that turns out to be the greatest advantage of all. 10 years later, the same woman who supposedly had no chance had built the company every competitor was trying to imitate. The startup everyone dismissed had become the standard for the entire industry. She wasn't just successful, she wasn't just wealthy, she had become the person everyone else was trying to catch. She owned the industry. This is her story. Sophia Bennett never imagined herself becoming one of the most influential entrepreneurs in her industry. She didn't grow up dreaming about running a billion-dollar company. She wasn't fascinated by boardrooms, investment rounds, or business magazines. She simply wanted what most people wanted: a stable life, a steady paycheck, and enough financial security to stop worrying about money. She grew up in an ordinary middle-class family where financial stability mattered far more than ambition. Success wasn't measured by how much you built, it was measured by how little you risked. Find a stable career, pay your bills on time, save a little every month. Avoid unnecessary risks. That was the formula. And for many years, Sophia followed it. She graduated from college, accepted ordinary jobs: customer service, operations, administration. Nothing glamorous, nothing exciting, nothing that suggested she would, one day, build a company capable of changing an entire industry. From the outside, her life looked completely ordinary, but something unusual was happening behind the scenes. Every job taught her something: not about management, not about corporate politics, not even about business. It taught her about people. Every day she listened to customers describe the same frustrations, the same delays, the same confusing processes, the same promises companies never seemed able to keep. At first, she assumed those problems were unique. Then she changed jobs and heard the exact same complaints again. Different company, different products, same customers, same frustrations. That caught her attention. While executives spent their meetings discussing quarterly targets, marketing campaigns, and financial reports, Sophia spent her days listening to the people actually using those products and services. She noticed something that almost nobody else seemed interested in noticing. Companies were making decisions based on what executives wanted, not what customers actually needed. Every new policy seemed designed to make life easier for the business, rarely for the customer. Most employees accepted that reality. After all, it wasn't their company, it wasn't their responsibility. Sophia couldn't. Every complaint felt like a clue. Every frustrated customer sounded like someone describing a problem waiting to be solved. She couldn't stop thinking about it. So she started writing everything down, every complaint, every inefficiency, every recurring pattern, every opportunity others ignored. At first, it was just a small notebook she carried in her bag. Whenever she noticed something unusual, she wrote it down. Lunch breaks became brainstorming sessions, commutes became research time, evenings became hours spent reviewing page after page of handwritten notes. Over time, those pages began telling a story. The same problems appeared again and again, different companies, different customers, the exact same frustrations. The more she wrote, the clearer the pattern became. She didn't realize it yet, but she wasn't simply collecting observations. She was building something much more valuable than a business plan. She was building understanding. While other entrepreneurs were searching for investors, Sophia was studying customers. While competitors focused on selling products, she focused on understanding why people were dissatisfied in the first place. She had no money, no influential contacts, no famous mentors, but she was quietly developing something far more difficult to copy, a deep understanding of a problem that almost everyone else had accepted as normal. And without realizing it, she was laying the foundation for a company that one day would force an entire industry to change. She just didn't know it yet. The hardest part wasn't finding an idea, it was deciding to act on it. Ideas are easy. Acting on them is what changes your life. Sophia had almost nothing. Very little money, no influential contacts, no experienced mentors, no investors, no impressive resume that opened doors. And unlike many startup founders, she didn't even have a carefully designed roadmap. She simply knew there was a better way to solve a problem, and somehow that was enough to convince her to begin. She rented a tiny workspace barely large enough for a desk, a laptop, and a whiteboard. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't inspiring, but it was hers. During the day, she worked a full-time job to pay the bills. At night, she became the founder of a company that barely existed. Her days started before sunrise and often ended long after midnight. Weekends disappeared, vacations disappeared, her social life disappeared. While friends were planning trips and celebrating promotions, Sophia spent her evenings answering customer emails, refining ideas, and trying to build something people couldn't yet understand. Some nights she was so exhausted that she fell asleep with her laptop still open, only to wake up a few hours later and continue working. Friends questioned why she was sacrificing everything for something so uncertain. Family members worried constantly. One relative asked her a question she would never forget. What happens if none of this works? Sophia didn't have a good answer because she honestly didn't know. Months passed, then a year. The business moved forward, but painfully slowly. Some weeks she celebrated getting a single new customer. Other weeks she celebrated simply keeping the lights on. Money remained tight. Every expense had to be justified. More than once, Sophia opened her bank account and wondered how much longer she could keep going. One evening, after another disappointing week, she sat alone in her tiny office staring at the notebook where the entire idea had begun. She flipped through page after page of observations she had collected over the years, customer complaints, broken processes, missed opportunities. She asked herself a difficult question. What if everyone else is right? For the first time, quitting didn't seem impossible. It seemed reasonable. She closed the notebook, turned off the lights, locked the office. But on the drive home, something kept bothering her. The problem hadn't disappeared. Customers were still struggling. Companies were still ignoring them. Nothing had changed. Except her confidence. The next morning, she unlocked the office again, opened the same notebook, and got back to work. Because every customer she helped reinforced one belief. The problem was real. The solution worked. The world simply hadn't noticed yet. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were starting from behind? No money, no powerful connections, no special advantages, just an idea and the determination to keep going. Because that's exactly where Sophia is right now. Working 2 jobs, watching her savings disappear, questioning herself almost every single day, and still with no idea whether any of this will actually work. Most people would stop here, but what Sophia does next is the reason we're telling this story. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and let's see what happened when the world finally started paying attention. Building a business wasn't exciting, at least not in the way most people imagine. There were no magazine covers, no interviews, no investors competing for meetings. There was only work, the same work, every single day. Repetitive, demanding, lonely. For years, Sophia kept improving the product while almost nobody noticed. She answered customer emails herself, handled sales herself, scheduled meetings herself, solved technical problems herself. If something went wrong, it became Sophia's responsibility. Some days ended with progress, others ended with disappointment. A potential client would sound excited during a meeting, then disappear without another phone call. Weeks of conversations often ended with a polite rejection. Money remained tight, growth remained painfully slow. One evening, after losing another customer she had been counting on, Sophia remained alone in the office long after the building had emptied. She opened her financial spreadsheet, calculated how long the company could continue if nothing changed. The answer made her stomach sink. She had far less time than she wanted to admit. She stared at the screen for several minutes, then she closed the laptop, turned off the lights. But the next morning, she came back, not because she suddenly felt confident, because the problem she wanted to solve was still there. Customers were still struggling, and she couldn't convince herself to walk away knowing she had a better solution. Then, something unexpected happened. One customer recommended her service to another. She didn't even know it had happened until the new customer called and said, "A friend told us we needed to talk to you." Soon after, another referral arrived, then another, then another. Without expensive advertising, without investors, without a massive marketing budget, the company began growing through something much more powerful. Trust. People weren't buying because of clever marketing. They were buying because other customers genuinely believed in what Sophia had built. Every successful project created another recommendation. Every recommendation created another opportunity. Slowly, momentum appeared. One extra customer, then two, then five. Then entire weeks where new inquiries arrived without Sophia making a single sales call. For the first time since launching the business, growth no longer depended entirely on her. The market had started doing something remarkable. It was selling the company for her. For years, the largest companies in the industry barely knew Sophia existed. If they heard her company's name at all, they dismissed it as another small startup that wouldn't survive. Then something unexpected started happening. Large companies began losing customers. Executives blamed the economy. Then aggressive pricing. Then changing market conditions. Marketing teams launched new campaigns. Sales departments were told to work harder. Consultants were hired. Reports were commissioned. But the numbers refused to improve. Customers kept leaving. Eventually, someone asked the question nobody had been asking. Where are they going? The answer surprised everyone. They weren't leaving the industry. They were leaving for Sophia's company. Not because it was the biggest, not because it had the largest marketing budget, not because it was the cheapest. Customers were switching because they felt heard, because when they pointed out a problem, someone actually listened. When they suggested an improvement, someone acted on it. That difference changed everything. Competitors studied her pricing, then analyzed her technology, then copied her marketing. None of it explained what was happening because they were trying to copy the product. When the real advantage had never been the product, it was the philosophy behind it. Then came the moment that made it undeniable. Sophia received an invitation to speak at the industry's largest annual conference, not as an attendee, as the opening keynote. She almost didn't believe it. Just 3 years earlier, she had sat in that same conference room in the back row, taking notes on a legal pad, wondering if anyone in the room would ever know her company's name. Now she was being introduced to an audience of 2,000 executives as the person who had quietly changed the rules of the industry. When she walked onto that stage, the applause was immediate. She looked out at the faces, competitors who had once ignored her, investors who had once rejected her pitches, journalists who had once refused to return her calls. She took a breath. Anne spoke for 45 minutes about the only thing she had ever really done differently: listening. That speech was shared more than anything else in the conference's history. One investor who had rejected her 3 years earlier approached her afterward. He extended his hand and said, "I wish I'd listened the first time you called." Sophia shook his hand, smiled politely, and moved on. 10 years after launching the company, Sophia Bennett stood before thousands of employees at the company's annual meeting. The applause lasted several minutes. Looking across the room, she saw something almost impossible to believe. People from dozens of countries, teams she had never imagined leading, departments that hadn't even existed when she started, millions of customers. Operations across several countries, a business valued in the billions. The woman who had started with no money, no influential connections, and no clear business plan had become the person setting the direction for an entire industry. Journalists often ask the same question: how did you do it? They expected to hear about lucky breaks, perfect timing, brilliant strategies. Sophia almost always disappointed them because she never talked about luck. She talked about the notebook, the one she had carried everywhere for years before starting the company. She would hold it up whenever someone asked about the secret behind the company's success. "This was my first business plan, not a polished presentation, not a 100-page strategy, just years of listening carefully to people nobody else was paying attention to." She had started with the least and built the most, not because she had been lucky, not because the timing had been perfect, but because she had understood something most of her competitors never did. The customer was never the obstacle. The customer was always the answer. Everything else had simply followed from that one insight, one customer at a time, one improvement at a time, one ordinary day at a time. Until one day, she wasn't chasing the industry anymore. The industry was chasing her, and somewhere in the back of a cabinet in her office, that original notebook still sat exactly where she had left it. Pages filled with complaints, observations, and questions nobody else had thought worth asking. The most valuable business plan she had ever written. The one that started everything. Sophia's story isn't really about building a billion-dollar company. It's about what happens when you pay attention to the things everyone else has decided to ignore. The customers nobody was listening to. The problems nobody wanted to solve. The notebook nobody thought was worth keeping. She didn't start with more than everyone else. She started with less. But she understood something that all the money and connections in the world couldn't replace. The problem. And sometimes, understanding the problem better than anyone else is the only advantage you need. Subscribe to Profit and Peril for more stories like this one. And leave a comment. What's a problem you've noticed that nobody around you seems to care about? Because sometimes that's exactly where it all begins. It belongs to the people who refuse to stop. See you tomorrow.